This time in the Prop Master, well, we get started on a ton of work. It's not that hard, it's really more of the tedious kind of thing. Some of it might be a little bit daunting, but don't worry, by the time we get finished with it, it's gonna look pretty much the same as it does now. Don't worry, it may look similar, but it's going to be stiffer, more durable, and ready for a Boba Fett paint job. But before we get started on the armor, let's talk about some materials. I've had several people comment and ask me why I chose to make the armor out of EVA foam. Well, basically it comes down to aesthetics, at least as far as the thickness of most thermoplastics are concerned. I know the actual movie prop used thin plates, and I've seen some amazing armor made out of Sintra, specifically some beautiful clone trooper armor that I saw at a fair one time. It's just amazing, but when you walk up close, it just looks a little bit flimsy. Now, even though most thermoplastics are about the right thickness for, medieval plate armor, Boba Fett's armor looks more like modern body armor, which is quite a bit thicker. And because of that, in my opinion, Boba Fett's armor looks better if it's thicker, like modern body armor. And that's basically why I felt that the 1/4-inch EVA foam was the only way to go. But then I did a little bit of research, and I found this. This is 1/4-inch thick Sintra. It's mostly used for sign making and also for mounting photographs on. And I think this is possibly the perfect material for making Boba Fett's armor. So the question is, which one do you use? There are pluses and minuses to each. Sintra can be worked and shaped using the exact same techniques as the EVA foam, but with the added plus of being very rigid and much stronger, which, makes it perfect for armor. But it's also 5 times heavier than the foam. Not that big of a deal here, but it's good to know. It's also an order of magnitude more expensive. The EVA foam was about $7, and the same amount of Sintra is probably going to be about $70. And at least for this 1/4-inch thick Sintra, you're going to need a bandsaw or a jigsaw to cut it out. And also, unlike the EVA foam, you're unlikely to find this at your local hardware store. And then there's the safety. Sintra is a PVC foam, and the C in PVC is chlorine. So when Sintra is heated, it releases chlorine gas. That's right. When you heat up your Sintra in order to shape it, it's going to emit the same gas that was used in World War I as a chemical weapon. So unless you like the idea of hydrochloric acid forming in your lungs, you're going to need to use a chlorine-rated respirator every time you heat up Sintra. So basically, if you can find it, and I'll post a link below so at least you can see where I got mine, it's probably the better choice, at least for the upper half of the armor, shoulders, collar, chest, abs, that kind of stuff. It's definitely the better choice. But it's heavier, it's more expensive, it's less available if you need to get more, it's less comfortable, or at least let's say its fit is less forgiving because of how rigid it is, and you're going to need to use safety equipment anytime that you heat it. Gloves and a respirator. I know this all makes it sound like I am anti-Sintra. Believe me, I'm not. If you can find it, can afford it, and either have or want to buy the safety equipment, then it is definitely the way to go. If not, you're probably better off using the EVA foam. Now, for the codpiece and the knee armor, I suggest staying with the EVA foam all along, just because the added comfort of the foam and the codpiece And if you kneel down onto an uneven surface with the Sintra, as far as the knee pads are concerned, you're probably going to pick up some damage. As far as the back, you could probably go either way. Now, as for me, I'm going to go ahead and do both, so that way you can see both instances. And because of that, that's a lot of work, and we better get started. So first things first, if you've skipped over the intro to this video to get past the boring stuff and on to the good stuff, and I do that as well, go back and watch the intro, because in this particular video there's a lot of really important information there. So go ahead and rewind it back, and we'll get started when you get back. Now with that out of the way, let's go ahead and slap some paint on this beautiful armor. Well, not so fast. There's several decisions we're going to have to make before we start painting this. Mostly, this foam is really good stuff, but it is still foam and can be damaged fairly easily. So we're going to need some way to protect it. The two main ways of protecting it is to seal it with some Plasti Dip or some form of that, or what I've done in the past on the helmets, of course, is to cover it with urethane. And that's the main decision that you're going to have to make. Now, they each have advantages and disadvantages. Let's start out with the rubber spray. In the United States, your two most common choices are going to be either Plasti Dip spray or Flexi Dip spray. I know in Europe there's also Gummy Dip, and I'm sure there are some others, but it's basically just a spray-on rubber coating. Often it's advertised that you can peel it off, but that's not very easy with the foam. One of the first things to think about with this is that this stuff is extremely toxic. You don't want to breathe it in, so you need to be wearing a respirator, or you need to be outside or in a well-ventilated area. Another possibility in that same area is to use some kind of a paint-on rubber coating. If you're anywhere near a Cosplay supply store or go to one online, you'll find probably Flex Bond or Flexi Paint. Those will work great. Disadvantages there is that they're a little bit more time consuming. You'll have to paint them on by hand, and there's always the possibility that you'll have some brush marks, some brush strokes in there. Advantages are that you don't have to deal with all the toxic fumes. So if you're working in a dorm room or something like that, that's a big advantage there. I generally just go with the spray on because I can do it outside, and it's quicker and faster. If you're willing to go the extra step and get a little bit more durable protection, you can go with a semi-rigid urethane resin. I like this stuff. I used it on the helmet, obviously. Ends up with a coating that's not quite a hard hat coating, but it's similar enough. And it's pretty easy to use. I know it seems daunting. It's not something that you're going to see at the grocery store or something like that, but it's easy enough to get, and it's actually very easy to use. And I'll post a link down below to a place where you can order it online. Got a couple of samples here. This is one of my earlier prototypes with the Plasti Dip. And this is just a piece of foam that I contoured a little bit and put a couple of coats of the urethane on. One of the advantages, or maybe disadvantages, of the urethane is that you can sand it after it cures. The problem is, of course, you might need to sand it after it cures, depending on if you have any big drips or something like that. If you do get drips with the Plasti Dip, you can't really sand it. I suppose you can probably peel that area off, or try to, and spray over it. They're both still quite flexible, actually. Now, with the urethane, in the more concaved areas where there's multiple directions of curve, it's more rigid, quite a bit more rigid actually. You can still flex this quite easily, whereas the urethane is much harder to flex. If you get in more the direction that it's bending, it flexes a lot easier. But in this area, it's a lot harder. One of the other things you can see with the Plasti Dip is if I take my fingernail and if I push my finger in there, you can easily see that it made a mark. Now, those will eventually come out. Now, if it's extreme, it's not gonna, come out. But if I just put my finger in there, you can see the mark, but in about an hour or so, maybe a little less, that'll be gone pretty much. I do the same thing with the urethane, and there's no noticeable mark at all. So it's quite a bit more protection, a little bit more effort, and it's a little bit more expensive. So it's really up to you if you feel comfortable with this, you're not going to have any problem. If you're just walking around, then this will look great. It's probably the most common way to seal EVA foam. It's very durable and it is flexible, which is a big advantage with the foam. Fiberglass, for instance, would be really likely to crack with EVA foam, but this won't. Urethane's a bit more durable. It's going to take a lot longer, and it's going to be a little bit more difficult, but not a lot. It's really up to you. Convenience versus extra protection. But you can definitely get away with using the Plasti Dip. Now, one area where I would definitely suggest highly on using the urethane is on the knee armor. Now, once again, you don't have to. The Plasti Dip will protect it quite well, as long as you don't forget that this isn't a real knee pad. If you spend a lot of time, down on your knee or something like that, if you do that in a parking lot, especially something that's got a very rough texture, it's going to show up in the foam. So I would suggest for at least this part, go ahead and do the urethane. But as long as you're careful and don't drop down on your knees, a lot of times while you're at a con or whatever you're doing, then it's not that big a deal. I'll go ahead and show you how to apply both of these, and it'll just be up to you. So let's start out with the urethane. Now, if you don't want to use the urethane, you can just skip this part of the video and go on to the Plasti Dip part. When you go onto the Smoothcast website, you'll be able to find in the menus a list of distributors. Now, as Smooth On says, you can buy their products cheaper and get them faster if you go through one of your local distributors, and they'll have a list of them there. I didn't want to post a link to any particular one of them because depending on where you are, that would be the wrong place. If you can't find anything close to you, then you can go ahead and buy it from Smooth On. They say it'll take longer and cost a little bit more, but I didn't notice that it was any more expensive, and I still got it in about a little over a week. So it's not that slow. It can be a little bit overwhelming with the different choices of different plastics and casting materials that they have, but just do a search for Smoothcast 66D, and that should take you on the website wherever you want to go. When you get your kit, and I would definitely suggest getting the little starter kit, I think they call it, test kit or starter kit. It's pretty small. The reason why I wouldn't get a larger amount is that they have a fairly short shelf life. The different parts A and B, they absorb water. Once you open the lids, you've started a clock on how long they're actually going to be good for. Now, I've successfully used some of this that I've had for a year, but it doesn't work quite as well. So I would definitely suggest buying the smaller amount, unless you're going into mass production and going to make hundreds of pieces of armor. I would definitely suggest going with the smaller kit. You know, you open it up, it's got the different parts in there. And the basic thing that comes in the kit are some directions and these two chemicals here. You're also going to need some containers to measure your portions. I'll post a link on how you can get these. In the past, what I found works extremely well are the little measuring cups that come with children's medicine. But I finally ran out of those after, you know, a million, it seems like. You're also gonna need something to mix the two parts in. I just like a plastic cup. And you're gonna need a cheap brush. These are really cheap. I also have some that are a little bit more expensive, but a little nicer. You don't want anything really nice because this is a one-use time. This is going to be a one-use product, and you know, after this first time, this brush is just trash. You throw it away. It doesn't matter which way you go, the spray or the urethane. The first thing you want to do is to go ahead and it's called heat seal the foam, and basically that's just going to get rid of any of the little fuzzies and stuff that are on there. Now, about an hour ago, I shook both of these really well. I wanted to do it well in advance so there was no bubbles that were still in it. But I've got a couple of chopsticks. You can use, you know, any kind of pieces of wood you've got, or anything that you can stir with. And I'm just going to give each one of these a good stir. I don't want to shake them up right now because I really don't want any bubbles to be in there. You can do this by weight, but it's not equal, so you're going to have a harder time calculating everything. It's listed in the directions and also on the bottles, I believe. But if you're going to go by volume, then it's just equal amounts of part A and B. So I'm going to do 1 ounce. Okay, take 2 on doing this, and this time I'll try not to, you know, spill everything everywhere. So I'm going to go ahead and actually, since I'm doing both of these, I'm going to go ahead and put in 2 ounces of each part A and part B, or part B and part A. And make sure you go ahead and close these off right away because, like I said before, these do absorb moisture out of the atmosphere, and that definitely shortens their life. This one's a little bit harder to see. I tried to find some that had little printed marks on them that are easier to read, but I could not find anything that wasn't, you know, 8 ounces. Okay, so notice that I'm wearing gloves and I'm outside, got the garage door open, and I've got the fan going, so well ventilated. This particular urethane does not smell bad, but they still suggest being in a well ventilated area. So once I pour these in here, I'm going to have 7 minutes to go ahead and do whatever I want to with them. After that, it gets to be too well cured to do anything smoothly. And so we pour these in. Just gonna use my brush to give it a little stir. And just brush it on. When you first do this, it's going to be extremely thin, which is probably good because then it'll maybe soak into the foam a little bit better. The bad thing is that it's being more likely to get drips. I would normally set a timer, but since my timer is also my camera, I can't really do that right now. I don't want it to get any big runs on here, but other than that, I'm not too worried about, you know, fingerprints or anything like that at this point. I just want to make sure that I get a little urethane everywhere. Kind of needless to say, but you want to make sure that you don't have any dust, or you want to clean off the foam as well as you can. I just used some compressed air to spray everything off. Onto this piece. It's kind of gone from the consistency of water to the consistency of paint at this point, so it's a little bit easier to work with. The reason why I'm doing the back is just because I want to make sure that it's one sort of continuous shell at this point. I don't want there to be an edge where the urethane stops, because that is always a point where it, if you have a little edge there, there's always a possibility that you can peel it up. Holding this so awkwardly. Okay, it's getting a little bit thicker now. It's quite warm today, so I'm sure that's probably accelerating the process a bit. You can kind of see in there, it's definitely a lot thicker than, it's like a real thick paint now. I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit more on here. I just want to make sure I got a good thick coat on here. It is starting to get too thick to brush without getting bad marks. Yeah, at this point it's extremely thick, and I don't want to do any more with the brush. Like, this has gotten so thick so quick that I'm going to go ahead and, no, I'm not. That has gotten, now it's so thick it's almost like the blob coming down here, and I'm not going to pour that on. If you work a little bit faster, the idea is that you could, when it gets about the consistency of not quite as thick as honey, but maybe syrup, then you can pour it on and move this around so that you can get a fairly thick coat of it and just, you know, let it flow around. We'll do that next time. Unfortunately, oh, I didn't put my lid on here. Definitely put the lids on as soon as you pour them in. Unfortunately, to do a second layer, we have to let this completely cure, and that's going to take an hour. So we'll be back in an hour. It's been about 5 minutes. You can see where the thicker amounts have started to turn gray already. I can't really see that yet. But I'm going to go ahead and move this over like this, because I've noticed when too much of the urethane slowly melts, you know, oozes down while it's curing, you get lots of little bubbles, and I don't want those. So I've waited about 5 minutes, and I'm just changing the orientation. And we'll be back in about 50 minutes. Okay, it's been a little over an hour, and everything is completely cured. Don't be surprised if you have to pry this off of whatever surface you're working on. Don't worry about it. Just peel it up and you know, clean off whatever has come off with it. At this point, we've got a good enough layer here that doesn't have to look good, just has to be, you know, there. So from here on out, I can use, I'll take some cups and I can set this on top of those cups to dry. And I'm mostly at this point going to be worried about the outside surface. Now, if there's any large drips like that, the first thing we want to do is probably go ahead and sand those off. So anywhere else where there's just a ridiculously large drip or buildup, and I don't see anything else. Okay, now since I've sanded that, I want to go ahead and clean that off good. Okay, so I have a new brush. The old one, not so good anymore. Solid as a rock. And we just want to repeat the process. This time I'm going to try to work a little bit faster, so hopefully I can get a chance to pour it. I think I'm not going to go quite as much this time. I used a lot last time. So I did 1.5 there, so let's do 1.5 here as well. I'm going to see if I can work a little faster this time. I just want to make sure I get in these areas where it peeled up before. The most important area is going to be, of course, this front part. I think I said the same thing in the helmet video, and that is you just gotta have to give up the notion that you're gonna have complete control over this. Just kind of go with it. Any mistakes that happen now are easily fixed later on. I'm wearing gloves for a reason. So I'm not going to worry about getting it on my hands. I'm just trying to hit any areas where it's pretty obvious that it didn't get a good coat last time. Now I'm just waiting for this to thicken up to the consistency of maple syrup. It seems to be thickening up a little bit, and it's quite warm, so I'm just going to pour some of it on here. Not too much, so I want to make sure I can work this around. It's amazing me how quickly this is setting up. Of course, part of that's probably that I'm working on two separate things. It is so thick now that I probably waited a little bit too long. It's acting like the first coat was not 100% cured. It's like it's a little bit not wanting to stick. It's kind of beating up a little bit. But we'll see how it cures. And wait an hour and take a look at it. Okay, we're back. And I was right. That layer before this one, I read the clock wrong, and it was only it only cured for 40 minutes. And you can see these little spots. Where it's almost like it beads away from, or pools up around these areas. That just seems to happen when it doesn't cure for a full hour. This time it most definitely has cured for a full hour, so we should be good with the next coat. But because of all the sort of the dimpling caused by that, I'm going to go ahead and give this a light sand. Okay, I sanded this one down as well. The difference is I didn't use the 60 grit on this because it only has a couple of thin brushed on layers of the urethane, whereas I actually poured the urethane on here. So let's go ahead and do another layer. And I think this time I'll go ahead and pour the remnants onto here. Dealing with how much of this is curing so fast, I think what I may do is actually just not do this one. I may concentrate with this batch just on this. Just on this knee pad here, and then I'll just mix up a different batch to do this one. So. Typical. I think I know where the camera's pointing, but I'm wrong. I'll definitely say that working on multiple parts is more difficult than with the helmet, where you're basically just concentrating on one thing. So I think I'm probably going to limit this to the knee pads, where I know it really does need that extra protection. Still a little bit liquidy in here. Maybe I'll go ahead and brush a light coat onto the front of this piece here while I'm waiting. Okay, now it's starting to thicken up enough. Doing a terrible job of getting this on video. I don't want to brush this on, but if I can get it to just kind of pour on. No, too late. Look at that. It's already where it basically turned into a gel. It is very warm here. Today it's close to 100 degrees right now, so it's definitely speeding up the curing time. And more importantly, once it starts to go, it goes very quickly. So what I'm going to do now is set this cup over here. I'm going to grab a different cup. And you know what? Now that I think about it, since I brushed onto that one, I don't want to put a second coat on that until an hour has passed. So when you do it, just work on one piece. When that one's done, then you can just mix up another batch and work on another piece. But since I went ahead and brushed a coat on that, I can't work on that right now, so I'll be back in an hour. It's been an hour, and I don't even know why I haven't checked this. I know it's going to be dry. So I got a little string on there when I was working on the other one. Some of these drips are getting a little bit extreme, so I think I'm going to sand those off real quick. I didn't really do much sanding, I just knocked off some of the drips that were on there. Just 1 ounce each. Oh, since I didn't use that other cup and it's been an hour, I went back to the dirty cup. No point wasting. So, and unfortunately, like I said before, I'm out of my really cheap brushes, and I'm going to have to use just a regular cheap brush. I'm being fairly sloppy with this. I'll go back after we get all this done and sand everything smooth. I'm really just trying to get material on here. Maybe I should have sanded this one. Definitely have to do that when this cures. Now this, I'm not going to brush that one. trying to hold this in a different way each time so that I'm not constantly messing up the urethane in the same spot every time I do this. Fortunately, that means I'm just going to basically sit here and wait for this to cure. It's thickened up enough that I can pour it without it just pouring like water. Still quite thin, but I think what I'm going to do is just pour little bits on. I guess the sensible thing would be to hold it over the cup. I've said this a couple of times, you just have to go with it. It's going to be messy and you're not going to have a lot of control over what's happening. That's okay. Just let it happen. Trying to keep it off of your skin, though. It's starting to thicken up pretty good now, so I'm going to put quite a bit on. This would probably be a good time to put one of those, glue a little stick onto the back. Maybe I can get one more little. I think the first time I did it, I got most of the thickness on the tip, so I'm going to try to get most of the thickness at the top this time. This is definitely going to stick, but that's okay. It's still dripping, and I can still get it to run a little bit in there, so I'm going to keep moving this around. What I don't want it to do is to all slowly ooze away from the highest point. I'm not worried about the back being pretty. I just want to make sure it's strong enough back here that I can sand that off easily. Okay, I don't think that's doing much moving at this point. I'm going to go ahead and set that aside. Grab my clean cup. Now once that cures, I can use that cup again, obviously. Now you might be asking yourself, why not just go ahead and make the knees out of Sintra, since it's so much harder? You know, this just seems a lot of work and mess. And the answer to that basically is that if Sintra, if it was just a solid PVC plastic, it would be fine. But since it's a foam, it'll actually take damage, which is actually kind of a nice thing if you're, when you start weathering this, you know, you start weathering things with the Sintra, you can actually dent it and things like that, and it'll be fine because it's a foam. Unfortunately, it also means that if you go down on one knee and there's a pebble, it's going to knock a big hole in it. So that's the reason why I don't like to use the Sintra for things like the knee pads. We do the exact same thing. I'm going to go with, I could probably get away with a half of an ounce, to be honest. You don't want to get a lot of air bubbles in there, but I'm just kind of wondering if I can just avoid the whole brush altogether and just pour it on. Now on this one, everything ran down to the top, so I'm going to try to let everything run to the toe, I guess, or the tip, or the bottom. Still just way too thin. Just more of the ultra excitement of my videos. I don't know if you can see this or not. Boom. just flatten out some of these drips, a little ridge forming here. I'm just going to continue to kind of move this around until I can't see that there's any movement inside my cup. That worked out pretty well. I think that may be the way I was just doing it. You might use a brush on the first coat just to make sure you get everything. But, you know, for these you don't really need to go through a bunch of brushes. So maybe a couple of coats using the brushes, and then after that just, you know, let it thicken up a little bit and pour it on. Yeah, that's pretty gummy stuff at this point. I don't think it's going to move. Let those cure for an hour, and then we'll do another coat. It's been another hour, and we can do one more coat. I think probably just pouring on one more should be enough. You know the drill by now. I think I'm going to go ahead and do just the ½ ounce again. And now we just basically wait for 3 to 4 minutes. Okay, I think it's starting to thicken up a little bit. It's still pretty liquid, but it's not quite water anymore. Let's see, this one we did that, so I'm going to go back toward the bottom part. It's pretty thin still. Get a little bit better. Just try holding this like this. As it gets really thick, I want to go ahead and pour as much on as I can. I'm I'm having to resist the urge to get the brush and kind of smooth out that little ridge right there, but that'll make it worse. I can just sand it off at the end. It is still slowly moving, so I need to spin around like a centrifuge. Okay, switch cups. My gloves are nowhere near as messy this time because I wasn't holding it and brushing it, so I don't think I have to change those. I'm going to do things a little bit different on this one just to show you what I should have done. This is a stand that I made when I was working on the Sabine Wren helmet. It's just a scrap piece of wood. You know, it doesn't have to be a dowel. It could just be, you know, a stick. You know, like a regular piece of square lumber. Well, and this is just a piece of scrap foam, and I screwed it all together. I put a washer on this so that the screw would actually hold this in place. You can use hot glue. I like to use super glue just because it sticks really well, but then I don't seem to have a problem prying it off. I can pry the hot glue off as well, but it just doesn't seem to stick for me. I know a lot of people do it without any trouble. And I'm just gonna push this in place and hold it there for about 20 or 30 seconds. But now I can manipulate this a lot easier. If I'd done this to begin with, the whole thing would have been much easier. Although you'd want to probably do a couple of coats on the inside before you do anything else. Okay, so once again, ½ ounce of each one. So I'm kind of teaching in reverse this time. It's like I start out doing things all wrong, and then I slowly start doing things the right way, as I remember. Now, just gonna wait about 4 minutes probably, maybe 3. Okay, it's been about 3 minutes, and I don't know if you can kind of how much of that you can see. It's not like water anymore, it's a little thicker than that. So while it's still sort of thin, I'm going to go ahead and try to get a little bit on here. And now it's thickening up pretty good. Getting quite thick now, so a little bit in the cup, but it is very slowly making its way down. I don't think it's going to make it. I think I waited just a little bit too long to put the vast majority of this on. But you know what? It's okay. I'll have to sand this smooth, but that's not going to be difficult. Okay. I know that looks like a big coating of wax or something, but it's fixable. Back in an hour. Okay, everything is well cured now. So this is definitely as bad as I was afraid it might be. It's about 1/8 of an inch little ridge there, but it's easy enough to fix. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take this off because it's pretty good for painting, but it's not good at all for sanding. I've got my 60 grit sanding stick, and I just want to sand this off, but I don't want to pull this way because I think it's going to be really well adhered, but at the same time I don't want to, you know, push my luck and get anything underneath there to try to peel that up. I think it would be fine if you did go back and forth, but I'm not taking any chances at this point. Getting there. Let's try the Dremel tool on this. It worked pretty well for smoothing out that little ridge. I think what I'm really going to do now is go to my medium grit sanding stick. Just kind of go over everything. I don't want to use my coarsest stick because some of these areas, they don't have a lot of urethane built up on it. Because I was mostly concerned with, getting this front part. You can also use a file. It works pretty well in this. I like this because it has a nice curve to it here. I'm just smoothing everything out. At this point, I'm mostly just concentrating on large drips or globs of it. Just got a really big drip here, so I'm going to the coarse 60 grit again. Since our inside part doesn't have to be pretty, but you don't want anything sticking out that's going to be uncomfortable. Might be a job for the Dremel tool again. Especially the Dremel tool is generating enough fine dust. I think I'm going to go put on a dust mask real quick. Yeah, a lot of big drips here. Just be careful when you're using the 60 grit that, you know, it's the right thing to use in these drips. Just make sure I'm not also hitting, you know, some of these other areas where it's pretty thin. I also have this little ridge here. I want to smooth that down. I think I'll switch over to the Dremel to do the fine shaping of this. And then I'm going to go with the medium grit, just kind of smooth things out. This is just a sanding block. It's a sort of a light medium grit, probably 200. You can see some areas here. And what this is it's areas where a layer of urethane has been sanded so thin that it is sort of the bond between it and the other layer is weaker than the urethane itself, so it kind of peels up a little bit. When that happens, you just want to make sure you go to a fine sandpaper to finish that up. It's not really in danger of peeling the whole layer up, but if you want to get that into a smooth area, you want to go with a finer sandpaper. Anything more aggressive will tear chunks out. This is a sanding block that is probably close to 100 grit. The advantage that these foam sanding blocks have over the sanding sticks when you're doing curved surfaces is the fact that they'll kind of mold to the surface instead of trying to make flat spots everywhere. So when you get to the point when you're really just trying to take off any texture, then you can still use the sanding sticks, just don't push down as hard. The foam blocks are a pretty good tool at that point, but you don't have to use them. Got some drips here, but this doesn't have as thick a layer of urethane on it, so I'm just going to use the medium grit. Of course, it's probably worth pointing out that if I had, especially these drips here, if I had just wiped those off while they were still wet, I wouldn't have had to do all this sanding. You get in this area here, there's times when you just really can't wipe that off or brush it. You're going to end up making more sanding than if you just leave the drips on there. But if it's on the edge, definitely it's better to just go ahead and wipe it off. I just want to clarify on these areas down here. That's not where the urethane itself has gotten really thin. That's just where one layer of urethane on top of a different layer is now much thinner. There's still a lot of urethane down here before you would get to the foam. You can really see when you have a low area. So these areas are easily sanded. This area is not getting sanded because it's lower. that can, you know, just keep that in mind while you're sanding, and you'll know where to take down, because you don't want to like get in here and try to sand it that way. You're trying to bring this level of urethane down to that level of urethane, or at least make it a nice smooth transition. Another drip. And basically I'm just going to go through here and smooth everything out as well as I can. If I come across anything that is different than what I've already shown you, then I'll go ahead and show it to you. But until then, there's no point in you just watching endless minutes of me sanding. Okay, so I finished up all my sanding. Nothing out of the ordinary, just went through my different grits. But I've gone over everything. Some of these areas where the different layers are attached. That looks worse than it is. Actually, when I use my finger, I can barely feel if there's any difference there at all. So it's visibly very visible, but it's really not that big a deal. I kind of like all the little areas where the layers don't match up perfectly. That really is going to give it that look. It looks kind of crazy now, but once it's painted, it's going to give it that look of something that's been, painted, dinged, scratched, repainted, over a dozen times, which is perfect for armor. Now there are some areas where it's actually gone down all the way to just bare foam, and for those areas I do want to give it a little bit of extra protection. So I'm just going to, sorry, the trash truck has decided it's the right time to come and take the trash. So what I want to do for these areas is just take some super glue and put a little drop of super glue there. Wait just a second, and then I'm just going to wipe it off. I'm going to do that for any area that doesn't have anything over the foam. Just going to give it a little bit of protection. I'm not even sure it really needs it, but I feel better, knowing that there's something there. If you do by any chance have some little thin layer somewhere that is just kind of sticking up, it's loose, you can also use the super glue to glue that down. I think that's it for here. It's interesting, I've got a lot of these little bubble holes. You can see it better on here. It's like I have a problem with those every third time that I use the urethane. I do not know what the difference is. If I'm expecting it, it won't happen. If I'm not worried about it, it'll happen. It's not that big a deal as well. I'll show you how to fix that in the next stage. Super glue makes a pretty good varnish, actually. If I'm working with small wooden pieces, instead of trying to use a polyurethane or something like that, I'll just hit it with some super glue. It works really well. It makes a very durable surface. Just be careful, if you use a lot of super glue at one time, there are actually some pretty nasty fumes. Okay, now that we have all that, I'm just going to blow all the dust off of this with the compressor. You can also use canned air, or if nothing else, you can use a paintbrush and just clean as much of the dust off as you can. When you're done with that, we'll go on to the next step. Okay, so I've blown the dust off of these as well as I can, and you're pretty much done with this once you clean the dust off. These are ready to go ahead and prime. And maybe after you prime it that you see some area that needs to be sanded or reshaped a little bit. That's absolutely fine. It's hard to see at this stage, so once you get a nice coat of primer filler on there, sometimes you'll see something. And if that's the case, don't panic. Just go ahead and sand it to the way it needs to be, and then just hit it with another coat of primer filler. So let's go ahead and go on to the other pieces and the Plasti Dip spray method. But you'll have to learn about that in the next video. If you found this video helpful, and let's face it, you're still watching a video that's well over an hour long, so hopefully you did, take a second to hit that like button. Also, subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the series. In fact, why not click that little bell so you'll be notified as soon as my videos are up? Because your likes and comments are the only things keeping me motivated to make these videos. And of course, if you have any comments, post them below. I'll do my best to answer any questions you might have. So until the next video, thanks.